There's a ton of conversation in color grading circles about today's subject, film grain, how to get it, what the best way to get it is, when we should use it, on what images it works best, whether it needs to look more like a negative film grain or a positive film grain or a little bit of both. Lots and lots of discussion around film grain. And while I don't use film grain on every project that I tackle, I try to use it sparingly, I try to use it wisely. It is definitely a tool in my creative arsenal that I need to be able to use well. And that's what I want to talk about today really, is how I impart film grain in my images in Resolve, some of the things that I think about and some of the techniques that I use to find really good success with film grain when it's what's called for by a particular project or when it's what the client requests. That's what we're going to talk about today, how we can get really good looking film grain right within Resolve. By the way, if you have not subscribed to the channel yet, definitely encourage you to do so. We've got new content coming out every single week here on the channel. We do a live Q&A on Friday mornings where we talk about the subjects we've been exploring that week, and you can bring in your questions and ask me directly, and I answer as many of them as I can. Lots and lots of cool stuff happening here on the channel if you are interested in color grading or interested in any way in the color page within DaVinci Resolve. Let's dive in and talk about working with film grain. So, a couple of things that I want to talk about right off the bat. There's some principles that I think we can keep in mind when we are working with film grain. The first one is that we need to have some prerequisites in place before we can even begin to audition and evaluate the application of film grain to our image. Some of those prerequisites might ring familiar if you've hung out here on the channel before. We're going to talk first about the things that I always do when I'm grading, regardless of whether I'm adding grain or grading a documentary or a commercial or a film or a series, whatever it is. First thing I'm always going to do is set up my overall color management. That's simply using good color science to get from what the camera saw to what the display can show on an automatic basis. It's something that you should never overlook, something you always want to start off every color grade with. Next thing that I've done, I've set up template node graphs for every single shot in my timeline so that I have a structure that I can operate within. And the third thing that I've done is I've established an overall look for my images. That's living over here at the timeline level of my node graph. This look happens to be coming from some components in my Voyager LUT Pack. This is from the Pro set where we actually have individual modules that are imparting creative character onto our image. So we've got a contrast, and then a tone modifier, and then a palette happening here. And the look is an extra important thing for us to discuss today because one of the things that I try to emphasize when I am thinking about film grain and considering incorporating it into my images is that if you are looking to add film grain because you want to make your images feel more like they were shot on film, that's really just one piece of the puzzle. And the first thing you want to be mindful of when you are talking about imparting film grain is the other kind of core characteristics of your image and whether or not they agree with and feel like a film image or whether they feel fundamentally digital in nature. And just to give you an easy example, let's look at shot number 4 here. And let's take a look at the net of what happens when I select all 3 components in my look and turn them off and then on. Now, I'm not going to tell you that the components of this LUT pack that I'm using are film emulations, quote unquote. They're not. Although if I wanted to use a film emulation, I actually could use my Kodak 2383 LUT. That's a free download. I'm going to leave a link to it in the description for today's video. But regardless of the look that you're using, whether it's my 2383 or the components of my Voyager LUT pack or any other well-built set of looks, you want it to be something that works in sync with the filmic aesthetic that you're trying to go for. So if you're getting very low contrast or really like kind of bright reds like I'm seeing here in the base image, that's an image that no matter how good my grain is, no matter how artfully I inject grain into this image in this state is never going to feel credible with grain applied because its aesthetics do not at all agree with the aesthetics of a photochemical system. And even if the end viewer does not know that consciously, they know it subconsciously. So you are adding a characteristic of film, but you have other core characteristics that don't support the thing that you're trying to mimic the aesthetic of. So you're really going to have trouble creating a texture, a grain that feels authentic and doesn't feel just slapped on. And of course, that's the worst possible outcome for using grain, right? Maybe we do a little too little, maybe we do a little too much, maybe the size isn't quite right. But if the grain feels organic of and innate of the image, that's a win. And if the grain feels like you slapped it on top of there, that's of course a fail. That's the last thing that we want when we're color grading, no matter what we're doing. We don't want it to feel imposed. We want it to feel innate of the image, right? So just a couple of initial thoughts on how you're going to want to have your image set up and shaped prior to the application of grain so that you can find success when you do add that grain in. So let's turn this look back on. And I actually want to kind of continue down that thread for a moment and talk about another prerequisite for adding grain that I think is really important. So I'm going to end up adding my grain in just a moment here, off to the left of my main look. That's really where it's going to slot in best. I don't want to add it at the head of my node graph because I don't want my level of grain to change based on the way I move my nodes around in my primary grade. I want that grain to be a unifying rather than an element that diverges and shifts depending on what I did in my grade. I want the grain to feel consistent. So I'm going to do it at the end of my pipeline. And as I said, right here, directly underneath my final look. That's where that's going to be placed. But there's one thing that I actually want to do leading into the application of that grain before I add the grain. And this might sound kind of weird, but this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to go to this node number 1 that I've just pre-pended by hitting Shift S. I'm going to go to Gamma by right-clicking on the node and going to that Gamma submenu. And I'm going to select Linear. I'm now going to go to my blur, and we're going to blur things just a little bit. This is a really good tip. If you want to add grain that feels filmic in nature, if you go back and look at any photochemical film that was shot on film and has grain innate of that system, you'll notice that the most resolute thing, the sharpest resolution element in a film or an image that is captured and reproduced in that way, the most resolute, the sharpest element is the grain itself. So you want to have all of the rest of the image be just a little bit softer. And this nudge that I made here, this is probably going to challenge the YouTube stream in terms of whether or not you can even see it, but I'm off and now on, off and now on. You might not be able to see it super clearly, but I promise it's something that you and your viewer are going to feel. So you always want to do just a little tiny bit of blurring right before the application of that grain, okay? Now that we've got that and we are applying our grain to an image that is going to be able to absorb the texture in a credible way, let's just go into our Effects tab here and drop Film Grain on. Now, a couple of important things that I want to talk about right off the bat. The first one is these presets up here. 16mm, 16mm 50D, 16mm 500T. Which one do I go with? Which one is going to be perfect for my project? I'm going to let you in on a dirty secret. These don't mean anything. These are not innate of some profile of this particular set of, or of this particular film stock that's rated in this particular way. These are just presets for the below parameters. So if you like one of these presets or one or more than one of these presets and they help you get what you're looking for, cool, use it. But if you don't, this is not some sort of forensic model that has been built of a film stock. These are just sensible presets. So if you like them, great. If you want to do something custom, then you should feel totally empowered to do so. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to set my opacity for now all the way to a 1, just to make it really easy to see what I'm doing. And I am going to go to my preset for now, and I'm going to go to a 35mm 200T. Just as a starting point, and I'm probably going to go in and change my sliders after this point. That's going to give me a finer grain than I had just a minute ago with the 16mm. I've got that opacity all the way up, and you can see that I can increase the overall scale of my grain by changing this grain size. Maybe I want it to be a little bit smaller still. And the strength is, of course, going to increase or decrease the overall strength of the grain. And those two sliders are really the main ones that I'm going to work with. Your advanced controls, these are things you can go into and manipulate if you feel like you need to, but I generally don't do much with them. And with that established, I've kind of got, because I've got the opacity turned all the way up, I can see my grain really clearly. I'm going to now back it way off. I could do that with my opacity, or I could do it with my key output gain if I wanted to go in here and just be able to continually go in and refine that later on. And I'll give you my kind of rule of thumb for grain. This is something that you'll have to find your own preferences with. I had a jazz band teacher in high school. I played the guitar in jazz band, and I'm 16, I'm playing the guitar. I want to wail. I want to rock and roll. I want to let that Stratocaster rip. But I'm playing in the jazz band, and the band director at the time shushes what were actually the 3 guitar players who were sitting over there in the corner because we all wanted to wail. And he says, the guitar should be felt and never heard. And while I didn't like that advice very much when I was a 16-year-old trying to shred, it's actually really good advice when it comes to film grain. My take is that grain should be felt rather than seen. By the time you can really overtly see it and your viewer is noticing it, I think it's kind of failing. So here at this like 30% strength, 25% strength that I've scaled things back to, that's kind of like the intensity that I like to see grain live at, so that it's felt, but it's not really seen. And especially if you consider that we are blurring the image as well. If I turn this off and then on, you can see I'm reshaping the texture of this image. It's just not in an obvious way. Really, the most obvious way to see what I'm doing is to turn everything off. So that's kind of how I would set up film grain in a normal scenario. Now, if you're really going for like a Super 8mm or like a 16mm look and you really want to hit it hard, then maybe you want to go with like a coarser texture or a higher intensity or a greater grain size, for example. But in general, I kind of try to tuck things in, keep them nice and small and just barely noticeable, something that's going to be more felt than seen. And again, I just want to point out, like, we haven't even really graded any of these images yet, but like, let's go over here to shot number 2. We can see that grain dancing and doing its thing a little bit. And just look at what happens if I turn off this look. Like, it just doesn't really work anymore. It doesn't really feel innate of the image. It feels like something imposed. So we always want to be applying grain underneath a credible look that's also driving us at what we're trying to get. And that's really my theme with all this when I talk about grain is like, if you are applying film grain because you want to create a quote unquote more filmic image, if you want to have more of a tight emulation of what you might have gotten out of a film system, that's great that you're thinking about texture. You should be thinking about texture. But if that's the only thing that you think about, and if that's the only sort of allowance that you make for that aesthetic that you're going for, you're not going to be very successful in achieving that aesthetic, because that aesthetic is not just about texture. It's about contrast. It's about color. It's about the kind of things that you are typically going to get with a well-built look that is well aimed at your purpose when you are color grading, okay? So those are the main things that I think about when I'm using film grain. I think about the placement of it. I think about being subtle with it. I ensure that I'm underneath a look that supports the aesthetic. I make sure that I've got some blurring happening upstream so that I've got just a little bit of softness that's helping sell the idea of the grain. And really the last thing that is implicit in what we've covered thus far, but that I'll just call out real fast, grain, we want to have it be a unifying thing. We don't want to have it be a shot-by-shot, tailored and tuned thing. That's really one of the biggest challenges that film engineers and filmmakers were trying to overcome for the entire lifespan of film is, how do we get less grain in our images? And just as importantly, how do we avoid big jumps in the amount of grain between shot A and B? That's generally not desirable. That's generally going to create a bumpy viewer experience. So that's the other reason why I place this grain a couple of nodes here at the end of my node graph, and not just at the end, but at the timeline level, so that I'm hitting every image in my timeline, even in a sort of sampler platter timeline like we have here today, with the same type of grain, so that the grain is applying a unifying aesthetic to all of my images, as opposed to being a shot-by-shot adjustment that I'm making with the shot-by-shot adjustment that I'm making and altering the grain in each shot. And then the last thing that I'll point out with grain is, in the same way that it's like, all right, it's not enough just to think about texture. You got to think about your overall look. In the same way, like, that's great that we have good color management. We've got some nice looking images. We've got a look. We've got some tasteful grain in place. But we still got to go in and grade the shots, of course, right? And the order that we've done things today is the best order to do things in, where you can grade in the context of this grain, because that is going to change the way the images look and feel to you. So now that I have this full context established, I can go in and I can even cue off of the aesthetic that I've created in my overall look. And just as an easy example, I might say, well, this image is quote unquote a little more open, maybe bordering on overexposed, but maybe that's beautiful and filmic and has the sort of like organic textural feel that I seem to be driving toward and I seem to be creating with my overall look. And maybe it's awesome just to let it go. Maybe instead of bringing my exposure in and getting to like a more kind of normalized exposure like so, maybe I actually drive it further up and really kind of stretch out the negative and let it feel imperfect, let it feel organic, let it feel textural. That's one way in which your grain can actually cue your decisions, not just on a basis of well, what do you see and what does the shot need? But it can actually kind of stimulate your creativity and inspire you to think in a different way about where you might take the image that you are grading. So grain's a big subject. There's a lot of tools for it. There's a lot of philosophies on it. There's a lot of ideas and conversations surrounding this subject, but this is how I think about it. This is how I use grain when I'm called upon to in my grading practice. And this is something that we can obviously explore and discuss much further in our next episode of Grade School, my Friday morning live Q&A session, where we talk about these things in a live venue and we can bring up various aspects of the conversation and you can ask me whatever questions you might have on the subject. But this is how I use it. This is a great start. If you observe the couple of principles that we've talked about today, you're going to be well on your way to using grain successfully.